Some horses don't refuse to be trained, they refuse to forget. The first time Daniel Hayes laid a hand on the Mustang's neck, the world seemed to pause with him, like the dry wind itself had been caught mid-breath over the Arizona flats, and for one fragile second, the horse did not pull away, did not rear, did not strike like the others had warned. It simply stood there beneath the pale afternoon sun, ribs faintly outlined beneath a dust-dulled coat. Its dark eyes fixed on something deeper than the man in front of it, something far beyond the rusted fence. And the empty miles stretching in every direction, and Daniel felt it then, not fear, not yet, but something quieter, something that settled into his chest like a weight he couldn't name, because men like him didn't believe in signs, not after years of watching crops fail and fences fall and promises dry up like creek beds in July. But still, his fingers remained against the horse's skin, warm and trembling. And for a moment he thought maybe the stories were wrong, maybe this animal wasn't wild. In the way they said, maybe it wasn't broken beyond saving, maybe it was just waiting. But then the horse flinched, not from his touch, but from something unseen, something that rippled through its muscles like a memory surfacing too fast, and in the next breath it jerked back hard, hooves scraping against packed dirt, head tossing, eyes wide now, not with rage, but with a kind of panic that didn't belong to the present. And the man behind the fence let out a low whistle, shaking his head slowly beneath the sweat-stained hat, saying nothing at first, just watching Daniel step back, dust curling around his boots, until finally he muttered, "Told you, that one ain't like the others." And Daniel didn't answer, because his gaze was still locked on the horse, still trying to understand what he had just felt in that brief, impossible stillness before everything changed, the sun hanging low now, casting long shadows across the barren lot where no other buyers had lingered, because no one drove 300 miles out into nowhere for a horse no one wanted, a horse they said couldn't be ridden, couldn't be trusted, couldn't even stand the sound of its own shadow some days. And yet Daniel had come anyway, leaving behind a ranch that was more dust than grass, more silence than life, because somewhere along the road between losing everything and having nothing left to lose, a man either stops believing or starts listening, and Daniel Hayes had started listening, even if he didn't yet know what for, the seller finally stepping closer now. Boots crunching slow against gravel, lowering his voice like the land itself. "Might be listening. She don't fight you 'cause she's mean," he said, eyes narrowing slightly as the horse paced in tight, restless circles. "She fights 'cause she remembers." And the wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of heat and distant rain that would never reach this place, and Daniel reached for the rope anyway, fingers steady now despite the warning sitting heavy in the air, because something in that first moment, that quiet second when the horse had chosen not to run, had already made the decision for him, and as the rope passed into his hand, he didn't know he wasn't just taking home a horse, he was taking home a story that had been waiting far longer than he had. The road back to Daniel Hayes's ranch stretched long and empty beneath a sky turning the color of old copper, the kind of evening that made everything look softer than it really was, but there was nothing soft about the silence riding in the trailer behind him, because every few seconds the metal frame rattled just enough to remind him that the Mustang was still there, shifting its weight, restless, listening, as if the land itself were speaking in a language only it could understand, and Daniel kept one hand steady on the wheel while the other rested loosely near the gear shift, his eyes flicking now and then to the side mirror where he could just make out the faint outline of movement, a shadow within a shadow, and each time the horse stirred, the trailer gave a low, hollow echo that carried through the cab like a distant warning he could not quite place, and the miles rolled under the tires slow and steady, dust rising in pale clouds behind him, until the last sign of pavement disappeared and the familiar dirt road began to wind toward the ranch he had nearly lost twice in the past year, a place that used to hold the sound of cattle and windmills and laughter long gone, now reduced to creaking boards and dry fences leaning like tired men. And when the gate finally came into view, Daniel slowed the truck without thinking, as if something inside him needed a moment to prepare. Because bringing that horse onto this land felt different than hauling feed or tools or anything else he had carried through those gates before. It felt like crossing a line he could not uncross, and as the truck rolled to a stop, the engine ticking softly in the fading heat, he sat there for a breath longer than necessary, listening, and for a moment there was nothing, just the distant hum of wind brushing across open ground, until behind him the horse shifted again, sharper this time, hooves thudding once against the trailer floor. And Daniel stepped out, boots hitting the dirt with a dull crunch. The air carrying that familiar scent of dry earth and sunburned wood, and when he walked to the back and unlatched the gate, he did not rush, did not pull, he simply opened the space and stepped aside, waiting, because something told him that forcing this moment would break whatever fragile thread had formed between them earlier, and for a long second nothing happened, the trailer standing still like it held no life at all, until slowly, almost cautiously, the Mustang stepped forward, one hoof at a time, muscles tight beneath its skin, head low but eyes wide, scanning everything, the broken fence posts, the sagging barn, the empty corral that had not seen real use in months, and then it stopped just outside the trailer, turning its head sharply toward the far edge of the property where the land dipped slightly toward a stretch of scrub and rock, and Daniel followed its gaze without meaning to, squinting into the distance where nothing moved. Nothing changed, just the same dry stretch. He had walked 100 times before without a second thought, and yet the horse stood frozen, ears forward, body tense not with fear alone but with recognition, like it had found something it had been searching for without knowing it would be here, and Daniel felt that weight again in his chest, heavier now, because he knew that look. He had seen it once before in a different kind of silence, the kind that came after everything had already been lost, and as the last light of day slipped behind the low hills, casting the ranch in long, uneven shadows, the Mustang did not move toward the barn, did not look at the water trough or the open gate he had left for it, it only stared toward that patch of land as if the ground itself held a memory, and Daniel Hayes realized, standing there in the fading light, that whatever he had brought home was not just wild, it was carrying something unfinished, something that had not let it rest, and now, without a single word spoken, that burden had crossed onto his land with it. Night settled over the ranch the way it always did, slow and quiet, like a blanket laid gently over something worn and tired, but that evening the silence felt different, stretched thinner somehow, as if it might tear if anything pushed too hard against it, and Daniel Hayes stood by the fence longer than he needed to, watching the Mustang without stepping closer, because the horse had not moved from that spot, not toward the barn, not toward the water, just standing there with its body angled toward the far edge of the land, ears fixed, eyes locked on that same unseen point beyond the dip in the earth, and even as the temperature dropped and the wind shifted cooler against his skin, the animal did not relax, did not settle, it only breathed slow and steady, like it was waiting for something that had not arrived yet, and Daniel finally turned away to light the old lantern hanging near the barn door. The small flame flickering to life with a soft hiss, casting a weak circle of gold against weathered wood, and when he glanced back, the horse had not followed the light, had not reacted at all, and that unsettled him more than if it had panicked, because most animals either feared the dark or leaned toward warmth, but this one seemed anchored to something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with hunger or shelter, and he moved slowly then, setting a bucket of water near the open gate, scattering a small pile of feed just inside the corral, careful not to step too close, and for a while he watched from the doorway, waiting to see if the Mustang would approach, but it did not, it only shifted its weight once, nostrils flaring faintly as if catching a scent carried on the wind, and then it stilled again, and the hours passed that way. Quiet stretching across the land until the sky turned black and the stars came out sharp and cold overhead, and eventually Daniel went inside, boots heavy against the wooden floor, the door creaking shut behind him with a sound that echoed louder than it should have in the small, empty house, and he sat at the table without lighting the overhead lamp, just listening, because something in him did not want to break the night open with noise, and after a while he heard it, faint at first, a soft movement outside. Not the restless shifting from before, but something more deliberate, and he stood, stepping back onto the porch, the lantern light trailing behind him, and there in the darkness he saw the shape of the Mustang moving at last, slow, careful steps across the dirt, not toward the barn, not toward the water, but toward that same stretch of land it had been watching since sunset, and Daniel felt a pull then, quiet but steady, the kind that does not ask for permission, and he followed at a distance. boots pressing into the dry ground as he moved past the fence line, past the worn path he knew by memory, into the part of the property he rarely visited anymore, where the soil turned harder and the grass gave way to patches of rock and scrub, and the horse stopped there, just at the edge where the land dipped slightly, its head lowering, not to graze, not to drink, but as if listening to the ground itself, and Daniel slowed behind it, the wind brushing faint against his jacket, the night holding its breath around them. And for a long moment nothing happened until the horse shifted again and let out a low, quiet sound, not a call, not fear, something softer, something almost like recognition, and Daniel stood there in the dark, staring at a place he had walked past 100 times without a second thought, and for the first time he wondered if he had been looking at it all wrong, because whatever the Mustang had carried with it across miles of empty land, it had not come here by accident, and now, standing on that silent patch of ground, it was finally beginning to show him why. The horse did not dig, did not paw, did not make a sound beyond the slow rhythm of its breathing, but the way it stood there, head lowered still as the land itself, made Daniel Hayes feel like he had stepped into a moment that had been waiting long before he arrived, and he moved closer now, careful with each step, boots pressing softly into the hardened soil as if the ground might answer back if he disturbed it too quickly. And when he reached the edge of that shallow dip, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before, a subtle shift in the earth, not fresh, not obvious, just a slight unevenness where the soil seemed packed differently, like time had pressed it down unevenly years ago and no one had come back to question it, and he crouched there, resting one hand on his knee, the other hovering just above the ground as if unsure whether to touch it, while behind him the Mustang lifted its head slightly, watching him now instead of the horizon, its ears angled forward in quiet focus, and for a long second Daniel hesitated, because men like him learned early not to chase things that did not make sense, but there was something about the stillness of the horse, the way it had led him here without force, without urgency, that made him lower his hand at last, fingers brushing against the dry dirt, and the ground felt no different at first, just hard and warm from the day's heat. But as he pressed a little deeper, he felt resistance change, not softer. Exactly, just different, and he pulled his hand back, studying the spot more closely now and the faint lantern glow spilling from behind him, the shadows shifting with the wind, and he stood again, glancing at the horse, half expecting it to move away, to lose interest now that he had reached the place it wanted him to see, but it did not, it only watched him with that same quiet intensity, and something in his chest tightened, not fear, not yet, but a recognition that this was no accident, that whatever this place held, the horse had known it before he ever set foot here, and the thought settled heavy, because it meant this land, his land, carried a story he had never been told, and the wind picked up slightly, brushing across the scrub and loose gravel, carrying a faint metallic scent he could not place at first, until memory stirred, distant and unwelcome. The kind that comes without permission, and he straightened, turning slowly to take in the surrounding ground, noticing for the first time how the grass thinned unevenly in this patch, how the rocks sat just a little differently, like they had been disturbed once and then left to settle again, and he let out a slow breath, running a hand along the back of his neck, trying to shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something unfinished. Something that had been waiting longer than he cared to imagine, and behind him the Mustang shifted one step closer, not threatening, not afraid, just present, as if it had done its part by bringing him here and now waited for him to decide what came next, and Daniel Hayes stood there under the wide, silent sky, staring down at a place he had ignored for years, realizing that whatever he thought he knew about this land was no longer enough. Because sometimes the past does not stay buried, sometimes it waits for the right moment, and sometimes it takes a horse that refuses to forget to bring it back to the surface. Daniel Hayes did not sleep much that night, because once a man notices something he cannot explain, the world refuses to go quiet again, and long after the horse had stepped back from that patch of ground and returned to the edge of the corral, long after the lantern burned low and the wind settled into a slow, steady whisper across the land, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening not for sound but for absence, for the strange gap where certainty used to be, and before the first light touched the horizon, he was already up, boots on, coffee left untouched on the table, his mind fixed on that place beyond the fence, as if something there had begun pulling at him the same way it had pulled at the Mustang, and when he stepped outside, the air was colder than the night before, carrying that same faint metallic trace that lingered just enough to stay in memory but never strong enough to name, and he walked straight past the barn without checking the water or the feed, past the fence line where the boards leaned unevenly from years of neglect, and out toward the dip in the land where the horse had stood, the ground looking no different in the gray morning light, flat and ordinary and easy to ignore, and for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it all, if the night had stretched his thoughts too far, but then he saw the hoofprints, clear in the dust, circling that same spot, deeper than the rest as if the horse had returned there more than once, pressing its weight into the earth with purpose, and Daniel exhaled slowly, crouching again, his hand hovering before pressing into the soil, testing the same uneven resistance he had felt the night before. And this time he did not pull back, this time he brushed the dirt aside with his fingers, not digging, just clearing enough to see the surface beneath, and it did not take long before something caught the light differently, something not shaped by nature alone, a small edge, dull but defined, just beneath the packed earth, and he stilled, his breath slowing as he leaned closer, brushing away a little more until the outline became clearer, not large, not obvious, but deliberate. Something placed, not grown, and behind him he heard the soft sound of movement, the Mustang approaching at a distance, not rushing, not startled, just walking with that same quiet certainty it had shown from the beginning, and Daniel did not turn, because he already knew the horse would be there, already understood that this was not something he had found on his own. And as the light strengthened across the land, revealing more detail with every passing minute, the edges of that buried shape became impossible to ignore, and Daniel Hayes sat back on his heels, the dust settling around his hands, the weight in his chest heavier now but clearer. Because whatever lay beneath that ground was not an accident, and whatever had brought that horse here had not been chance, and for the first time since he had taken the rope into his hand miles away, he understood that he was no longer deciding what this story would be. He was following something that had already begun long before he arrived. Something the horse had carried across distance and silence until it reached the only place it was meant to end. Daniel Hayes did not rush the work, because some things demanded patience whether a man believed in them or not, and as the morning sun climbed slowly over the horizon, warming the dry earth inch by inch, he moved carefully, brushing away more soil with steady hands, revealing just enough to understand what he was looking at without forcing it into the open too quickly, and the shape beneath the ground began to take form, not large, not deep, but deliberate, a flat surface edged with lines too straight to belong to chance, and Daniel leaned back slightly, squinting in the light as it struck the exposed corner, a dull glint breaking through the dust, and behind him the Mustang stood quiet, close enough now that he could hear its breathing, slow and even, not restless anymore, not searching, just present, as if this was the place it had been waiting to reach all along, and Daniel wiped his hands against his jeans, glancing back at the barn for a moment before standing and walking toward it, because whatever this was, it would take more than bare hands to uncover, and he returned with a shovel, the metal catching the sunlight in a brief flash that made the horse shift slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, its ears flicking once before settling again, and that small reaction did not go unnoticed. It lingered in Daniel's mind as he stepped back to the spot and pressed the blade into the ground, the soil giving way with a muted resistance that felt older than the land itself, and he worked slowly, not digging deep, just clearing around the edges, careful not to strike whatever lay beneath, and with each movement the shape became clearer, a rectangular form, worn but intact, something that had been placed there with intention, something that had been left behind, and as the minutes stretched into something longer, the silence around him deepened, broken only by the soft scrape of metal against dirt and the distant whisper of wind moving across the open land, and when the top was finally uncovered enough to see its full outline, Daniel stopped, resting the shovel against his leg, his breath steady but heavier now. Because there was no mistaking it anymore, this was not debris, not a forgotten tool or scrap. It was something meant to be hidden, and the realization settled in slowly, like heat rising from the ground, and he crouched again, running his fingers along the edge where earth met surface, feeling the difference in texture, the way time had pressed dirt into every small space until it had almost become part of the land itself, and for a moment he hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that once he uncovered it fully, there would be no returning to the quiet ignorance he had lived with before, and behind him the Mustang stepped closer still, its shadow falling across the ground beside him, and Daniel glanced up, meeting those dark, steady eyes, and there was no panic in them now, no confusion, only a quiet expectation, as if the horse had brought him this far and now trusted him to finish what it had started, and Daniel Hayes let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the object with both hands, the dirt loosening slightly under his touch, and as he began to lift, the earth resisted at first, holding on with the stubborn grip of years, but then, inch by inch, it gave way, and something long buried began to rise back into the light, carrying with it a silence that felt deeper than anything the land had held before. The object came free with a quiet resistance, the kind that felt less like weight and more like time refusing to let go, and Daniel Hayes lifted it slowly, setting it down on the dry ground beside the shallow hole, dust falling away in thin streams as the morning light settled over its surface, revealing something worn but intact, a small metal box no longer than 18 inches, its edges softened by years beneath the earth, its surface marked by scratches that did not belong to nature alone, and Daniel stared at it for a long moment without touching it again, his hands resting on his knees as if the simple act of uncovering it had already taken something out of him, and behind him the Mustang stood closer now, no longer watching the distance, no longer searching, its attention fixed entirely on the box as if whatever it had carried across miles of silence had finally found its place, and the air felt different then. Heavier in a way that could not be explained by heat or wind, and Daniel reached forward at last, brushing away the last layer of dirt from the lid, revealing a faint outline where it had once been opened and closed, and for a second he hesitated, not from fear, but from the quiet understanding that whatever waited inside had been hidden for a reason, and once seen, it would not be unseen. And he exhaled slowly before lifting the lid, the metal giving a soft, tired sound as it opened, and inside there was no shine, no sudden revelation, just a collection of simple things resting exactly as they had been left, a folded piece of cloth worn thin at the edges, a small leather strap darkened by age, and beneath them, a stack of papers bound together by a strip of twine that had nearly turned to dust, and Daniel picked up the top sheet carefully, the paper brittle but still holding its shape, and as he unfolded it, the writing revealed itself in faded lines, steady and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had taken their time with every word, and he read in silence, his eyes moving slowly across the page as the wind brushed lightly against his back, and behind him the horse let out a quiet breath, the sound low and steady, as if recognizing something Daniel was only beginning to understand, and the words on the paper were not long, not complicated, but they carried a weight that settled deep, because they spoke of a place, of a choice, of something left behind with the intention that it would one day be found, and Daniel lowered the page slightly, his gaze drifting back to the land around him, the same land he had walked for years without seeing this hidden layer beneath it, and he realized then that this was not just something buried, it was something preserved, something meant to outlast the moment it had been written in, and the Mustang stepped closer again, its shadow stretching across the ground beside him, and for the first time since he had brought it home, Daniel did not see a wild animal standing behind him, he saw something else entirely. Something that had carried a memory longer than any man could, and as he looked back down at the paper in his hand, the connection between the horse and the hidden box began to take shape, not fully clear yet, but undeniable, and Daniel Hayes understood that whatever story he had uncovered was no longer just part of the past, it had found its way into the present, and it was not finished yet. Daniel Hayes read the page again, slower this time, letting each word settle instead of passing through, and the meaning did not come all at once, it unfolded in quiet layers, like the land itself revealing something only when a man stood still long enough to notice, and the writing spoke of a horse, not by name, but by presence, describing an animal that refused commands, that would not bend, not because it lacked discipline, but because it remembered something its rider could not forget, and Daniel felt a shift inside him as those words settled deeper, because the tone was not frustration, not anger, it was respect, the kind that comes from understanding something cannot be forced into submission without losing what makes it whole, and he turned the page carefully, the paper resisting slightly before opening to reveal more lines, more fragments of a voice that had once stood on this same land. And behind him the Mustang lowered its head just slightly, its breath brushing against the air in a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to match the pace of the words, and Daniel continued reading, the morning light growing stronger, illuminating the faint details he might have missed before, the indentation of the pen, the way certain words were pressed harder into the page as if they carried more weight than the rest, and then he reached a line that made him stop, not because it was long or dramatic, but because it was simple, clear, and final, a statement that did not ask for understanding, only recognition, and it spoke of leaving something behind, not as a loss, but as a promise, a belief that one day the horse would return, or someone would follow where it led, and that what was hidden here would be found not by chance, but by connection, and Daniel lowered the page slowly, his eyes lifting toward the land around him, the same quiet stretch of ground now holding something far greater than he had ever imagined, and he turned his head slightly, looking back at the Mustang, really looking this time, not as a problem to solve or a risk to manage, but as something carrying a purpose older than his own decisions, and the horse met his gaze without movement, without fear, just that same steady presence that had followed him from the first moment. And in that silence Daniel understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that the horse had not been brought here by him, it had brought him here, step by step, mile by mile, until the past and the present stood in the same place again, and the realization settled into him with a quiet certainty, because everything he had seen, the way the horse watched the land, the way it reacted to certain sounds, the way it led without pulling, it all pointed to something deeper than instinct. Something that could not be trained or broken or erased, and Daniel looked back down at the box, at the remaining pages still bound together, knowing there was more to read, more to uncover, but also knowing that the truth had already begun to take shape, not as a sudden revelation, but as a steady unfolding, and the wind moved again across the open land, carrying dust and light and the faint echo of something long forgotten, and Daniel Hayes sat there with the past in his hands and the horse at his side, realizing that whatever story had been buried beneath this ground had not ended when it was hidden, it had simply been waiting for the moment it would be understood. Daniel Hayes did not read the remaining pages right away, because some truths did not need more words once they had taken root, and he sat there for a long moment with the paper resting loosely in his hands, the morning now fully awake around him, the light stretching across the land in long, quiet lines that touched everything without asking, and beside him the Mustang stood still, no longer searching, no longer restless, its presence calm in a way that had not existed before, as if whatever weight it had carried across miles of open country had finally been set down. And Daniel looked at it again, really looked, seeing not a wild animal that could not be trained, but something that had chosen its own path long before he stepped into its story, and he reached out slowly, not to control, not to guide, but simply to acknowledge, his hand resting against the horse's neck where the sun warmed the dust along its coat, and this time the horse did not pull away, did not tense, it remained there, steady and quiet, its breathing matching the rhythm of the land itself. And something inside Daniel shifted then, something that had been closed off for longer than he cared to admit, because men who spend too many years losing things learn to stop expecting anything to return, and yet here he was, sitting on ground he thought he understood, holding proof that something had been left behind not as an ending, but as a beginning waiting for the right moment, and the realization did not come with noise or force, it came the way the morning light did, slowly, until it was impossible to ignore, and Daniel rose to his feet. Brushing the dust from his hands, the box still open beside him, the pages inside no longer hidden, and he knew he would read them all in time, not out of curiosity, but out of respect for the voice that had written them, the one that had trusted this land, and this horse, to carry something forward when it could not be carried any longer, and as he stepped back from the shallow hole, he did not cover it again. Did not try to return things to the way they had been, because some things were not meant to stay buried once they had been found, and the Mustang moved beside him, not ahead, not behind, just there, its presence no longer distant, no longer separate, and together they walked back toward the barn, the wind rising gently across the fields, carrying dust and light and the faint promise of something changing. And later that day, when a neighbor passing along the road slowed just enough to glance toward the ranch, they paused longer than usual, noticing something different without being able to name it: the way the horse stood close to the man, the way the man moved without tension, the way the silence of the place no longer felt empty. And word would travel, as it always did, about the rancher who brought home a horse no one else would take, about the land that held more than anyone had guessed, about the quiet change that settled over a place that had nearly been forgotten, and people would wonder, would talk, would try to explain it in ways that made sense to them. But Daniel Hayes would not argue, would not correct them, because he knew something they did not, something simple and steady and true. That sometimes what the world calls untrainable is only waiting to be understood, and sometimes the weakest horse carries a truth strong enough to guide a man back to what he did not know he had lost.